Chapter 7. Forewarned is forearmed. Morning delivered a damp fog. Braving the chill, Porter trudged the 2 miles to Elm House where she was to meet Mrs. Hewitt. The woman was waiting for her outside the care home. She was perched on a bench, smoking. Porter apologised for being late. "It doesn't matter, you're here now," Mrs. Hewitt said dully. "I'll just finish this. I need to settle my nerves." Porter suspected it would take more than nicotine. Mrs. Hewitt looked worn out. They entered the reception area and pressed the buzzer. They were still waiting for someone to answer it 5 minutes later. "They must be short-staffed," said Mrs. Hewitt, pressing the buzzer again. She was about to go outside for a quick fix when a carer poked her head round the door. "Hello, Mrs. Hewitt. Sorry to keep you waiting. A couple of staff are off sick. Are you visiting your mother?" The carer took Mrs. Hewitt's twitch as a yes. "We've just nicely finished breakfast. She's in the lounge. Follow me." The carer ushered them through the recently deserted dining room and into the lounge. Many residents were dozing in front of the television. The heat was stifling. "You get used to it," smiled the carer when Porter loosened her scarf. They snaked round clusters of armchairs to reach a woman concealed by a newspaper. "Visitors for you, Mrs. Walters," announced the carer, leaving them to get on with her chores. The reader remained hidden behind a broadsheet. "Hello, Mum," said Mrs. Hewitt timidly. No response was forthcoming. Mrs. Hewitt cringed at her mother's behaviour. Those residents still awake turned away from the television to stare. Someone lowered the volume. "I brought someone to see you, Mum." Porter was quick to tire of Mrs. Walters' childish ways. She stole 2 chairs from the conservatory and placed them either side of the woman. Mrs. Walters' paper could only screen her from one of them. She lowered her shield and glared. She was most likely the youngest resident, but a life of hate had done little for her skin. An unforgiving haircut fell short of softening the lines, which Porter suspected was deliberate. Mrs. Walters wished to intimidate in every way possible. She bestowed on her daughter a venomous look. Mrs. Hewitt flinched. "You've always been pathetic," her mother hissed. Porter introduced herself. "I would like to ask you a few questions, Mrs. Walters." Mrs. Walters returned to her paper. Mrs. Hewitt shrugged helplessly. They should not have come. Porter didn't expect a favourable reception, but after countless investigations, she had patience down to a fine art. She could sit for hours if necessary. Mrs. Walters sensed as much. "I don't need a doctor. I'm not sick," she snapped. "That's debatable," thought Porter. Bile oozed from her pores, forming a black halo around her shriveled form. "No, Mum, she's not that kind of—" Porter silenced her with a look. She felt the temperature drop when a former resident shuffled past. He entered the conservatory and sat by the window, his favourite spot when he had a pulse. Mrs. Hewitt coughed nervously. "Dr. Biggleswade wants to talk to you about—" "Look at the state of you, girl. You're a mess. I'm ashamed of you. You're an embarrassment." A cruel mouth spouted its cruel dialogue. Mrs. Walters was silenced by a cry. A man laboured to his feet and thrust his cards in his opponent's face. "You cheated!" The accused squared his shoulders. "It's not my fault you're a poor loser." Porter stifled a laugh, as the nongenarians were egged on by a surprisingly energetic audience. "Put those sticks down," a carer materialised to end their sport. "Imbeciles, the lot of them," Mrs. Walters snarled. "Join in, pet. You might enjoy yourself." A man wearing tartan slippers flushed his few remaining teeth. His friends tittered. "Surrounded by idiots," uttered Mrs. Walters, shifting her attention back to her daughter. "And you've always been a disappointment. You haven't improved with age." Mrs. Hewitt shrank in her seat, a child camouflaged by age. Silent tears splashed her jeans. "After everything I've done for you. That's it. Have a good cry. It's what you're good at." Mrs. Walters was too busy abusing her daughter to notice a woman in a red tracksuit approaching them. "I was wondering where you got to, you naughty girl." Shirley, the activities coordinator, wafted a clipboard under Mrs. Walters' nose. "You haven't signed up to anything. Now you know the drill, young lady. Sign up or be signed up. The choice is yours." Mrs. Walters looked set to grab the board and employ it for an entirely different purpose. Mrs. Hewitt held her breath. "You know I don't like to be kept waiting, you cheeky thing. I'll put you down for the felt making. It starts in 10 minutes. Mrs. Walters shuddered at the memory of line dancing. Shirley didn't make idle threats. Scouring the list, she opted for an activity no one else had signed up to. Topiary it is. That wasn't so hard, was it, my love? Shirley patted her on the head. Sod off. Temper. I'll sign you up for tadpole monitoring for that. I'm sure Keith will let you name them if you ask him nicely. Shirley bared her brightest smile before moving on to her next victim. Mrs. Hewitt was all amazement. The activities coordinator had the measure of her mother, and there was nothing Mrs. Walters could do about it. You'll pay for this, my girl. You mock my words, the woman hissed at her daughter. Porter requested a glass of water. Mrs. Hewitt tripped over in her haste to get away. Mrs. Walters glared at the retreating figure before closing her eyes. She had every intention of staying like that until supper. The other residents were all in favour of her catatonic episodes. Only Shirley seemed inclined to disrupt them. Porter folded her arms and waited. Elm House was every inch the waiting room for whatever comes next, with residents sated by breakfast and heat, gently drifting in and out of sleep. Some were as diminished as the wraith sitting among them, making it difficult for Porter to tell them apart. One of the more mobile residents fussed over his plants. He dusted their leaves while a neighbour made encouraging noises. Go away, Mrs. Walters said, her lids firmly closed. Porter remained defiant. The resident's aura darkened. I don't want you here. Tough. Lids flickered before grey eyes locked on black. Mrs. Walters scowled at her opponent, then barked at the carer handing out tablets. The woman braced herself. What is it, dear? I don't want her here, Mrs. Walters pointed at Porter. Oh, you don't mean that. We all love a visitor, don't we, dear? No. The carer turned to Porter. Mrs. Hewitt asked me to come, said Porter amicably. What about my sweeties? A man called from across the room. You're lucky to have someone willing to make the effort, dear. I would make the most of it if I were you, suggested the carer with a strained smile, going back to distributing pills. Mrs. Walters gazed straight to the door. I want Pam. Porter doubted Mrs. Hewitt would be rushing back. Uninvited guests can be such a nuisance, can't they? You look tired. Are you having trouble sleeping? Mrs. Walters barked at the carer again. Having finished handing out medicine, the carer ignored her and slipped from the room. She can't help you, said Porter softly. I want Pam. But Pam doesn't want you. Porter's comment hit a nerve. My daughter owes me. Is that why you're haunting her? Mrs. Walters opened her mouth and thought better of it. She shut her eyes again. Mrs. Hewitt returned to find Porter putting on a hat. Have you finished already? She voiced relief. For the moment, said Porter. Mrs. Walters twitched, a sign she had registered the threat of another visit. Mrs. Hewitt stared at her mother. See, then, she mumbled, leaving Porter's water on the table. She heard something smash as she left the room, but didn't dare look back. Did she say anything while I was gone? She asked Porter, while fumbling for a cigarette. Nothing of significance. I knew it would be a waste of time. She'll never forgive me for putting her in here, and now I've gone and made things worse. Mrs. Hewitt shuddered at the prospect of her mother's revenge. Porter didn't think things could get any worse when faced with the mental anguish presenting before her. Well, she won't be here for much longer if she keeps this up. The manager has already spoken to me about her behaviour. I said Mum has always been difficult, and she's not going to mend her ways now. But the manager says she's upsetting the carers and other residents, among other things. What other things? Asked Porter, scrutinising the frail form from under her brim. Mrs. Hewitt threw her cigarette butt away and lit another before responding. They keep finding Mum asleep, but with her eyes open. She's unresponsive at first, but she eventually comes round. She's probably playing tricks. She loves manipulating people. I don't know what I'll do if they evict her, though. Frank will go spare. When does it happen? It started at night, but now they find her like that during the day, too. Porter paused. She haunts you round the clock, doesn't she? Mrs. Hewitt's eyes widened. It can't really be her. It's impossible. But Porter knew anything was possible. We should put her to the test. How? Mrs. Hewitt asked nervously. Ask the staff to slip your mother a sleeping pill after breakfast for the next few days. Mrs. Hewitt looked confused. She can only haunt you at night if she's drugged during the day. I'm more likely to catch her in the act if I narrow her window of opportunity. Mrs. Hewitt looked horrified. I can't do that. It's your decision. I'm sorry, but I have to go. Frank will never agree, the woman continued. Porter wasn't so sure. He won't. Porter left her to her ethical debate.